Hello and welcome to the 27th Degree with Chris and Nancy. So this is episode 55. This will be Human Trafficking with Hassan Souto and Kayla Machado. We've had Hassan and Kayla here before. They did a great job, and we wanted to have them back in the new studio so we could discuss human trafficking again, such an important topic. But before we get into that, I want to thank our sponsor, Bay Coast Bank. Bay Coast Bank is just right for all of your financial needs. Visit baycoast.bank or call 508-678-7641 to learn more. As always, you can support the 27th Degree with Chris and Nancy by signing up as a patron. Go to patron.podbean.com/the27th Degree, or you can click on the link on our Facebook page. $5 a month gets you a shout out, exclusive content, and sneak peeks to upcoming shows. You can find the 27th Degree across social media, including Facebook, Instagram, and your favorite podcast platform. You can also subscribe to the 27 Degrees Consulting channel on YouTube. So let's talk a little bit about, tell me a little bit about yourselves first. Let's start with that.
Before we do start with Hassan and Kayla, and again, thank you for joining us. I just did want to say that we have done a human trafficking podcast in the past during kind of the height of COVID. I think some of our viewers will remember that at that point we had some issues with sound with Derek and Michelle Belong, who were gracious enough to talk to us about this very important topic. So we had a couple of requests to redo the podcast. And since you guys are so active on the task force and what have you, we're so delighted to have you again as guests to talk about this.
Yeah, we're happy to be here.
Absolutely.
Sure. So tell us a little bit about your background, and we can start, Hassan, with yourself.
Yeah, so I've been a social worker now for about 20 years. I'm a licensed social worker, and I primarily focus on marginalized groups and at-risk youth and victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and other types of violence in my community.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
That's excellent. And yourself?
I'm Kayla. I'm coming up on my 1 year now. Actually, one of my first events was here with you guys in the podcast. And so I'm coming up on that 1 year with the Women's Center now. I'm part of the Education and Outreach Department with Hassan, and I'm also a counselor. So
great.
You know, it seems like a trend, and maybe for like your second year anniversary, we should make sure we have you again.
I'd love to come back. We love being here.
It's always great to have you back. I mean, last time we had such a great discussion about domestic violence when you were on the show, and we touched a little bit maybe on human trafficking, but we really wanted to delve into this a little deeper. And as Nancy had mentioned, we had a podcast in the past on this, and it was such useful information, but we had a lot of technical issues at that point. It was COVID, and we were doing it remotely and all. So we felt it was really important to redo this one because this is information that everyone needs to know about. So maybe we can just start with just a definition of human trafficking, what it is, and how large the scope of the problem is.
So let's do the legal definitions. Human trafficking is the use of force, fraud, or coercion to get another person to provide labor or commercial sex. Worldwide experts believe there are more situations of labor trafficking than of sex trafficking, but there is much wider awareness of sex trafficking in the U.S. than of labor trafficking. And I feel for Kayla and I, we work at the Women's Center, a domestic violence and sexual assault agency. We were invited to join the Greater New Bedford Human Trafficking Task Force. That task force has been around since I want to say about 2019. And I joined about 3 years ago, and Kayla joined last year. And that really made us aware that this is something that actually is happening in our community.
Yeah. Hassan, can we talk about both types of trafficking? Because like you said, so many people are aware of the sex trafficking, but what is labor trafficking?
So I think the best way for people to compartmentalize and try to really digest what human trafficking is to think of human trafficking as the overhead, and then the two branches would be sex trafficking and labor trafficking.
That's a good way to think about it.
Yeah.
So it's like the umbrella.
It is.
It comes down to two different types.
Yep. So, the human trafficking task force that we work with victims of labor trafficking and sex trafficking.
So what's the like the mission, if you will, of the task force? What are you trying to accomplish?
So we have a pretty lofty goal. A few years ago, the federal government got, I hope my numbers are wrong, but about 94 of U.S. Congress people to get together and federally fund human trafficking task force,
Nice.
but to make sure that they will locally run task force.
Okay.
And part of the New Bedford task force is we also provide trainings, and it's a multidisciplinary team. So you have people like Kayla and myself who can help a victim get into counseling, maybe help them find a shelter, and then we have people on the force who are literally work for Homeland Security. And other officials like that who are actually the agents out there doing the physical work, and we're more to help victims get stabilized. We've helped people get U visas and help them get work and things like that because
Nice.
we try not to, when I say we, the goal isn't to deport some of these victims, it's to help stabilize them.
So
Now-
let me ask you. Sorry, Nancy, but just as far as the scope of the issue, do you have? I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you have numbers that give us a sense in the United States how big of an issue this is?
Yeah, I do have numbers. And one thing I will say is every time I get asked to talk about human trafficking, Kayla and I, the information is not as prevalent as you would think it would be online, sadly. But I can tell you that we've had about 81 cases of human trafficking in Massachusetts, but nationally almost 11,000
Wow.
for the last year.
That we know
Then
of.
that's
are
that we
here.
know of.
Yep.
Yeah, we know of. And that's
So-
in a year. Okay.
Yeah. So when I say, so for 2020, 10,583 situations of human trafficking. But when you hear that number, it's important to remember that of that number, I want to say 0.4% of them.
Yeah, it was 0.4.
Yeah. So we're not even getting the vast majority of them. So we're hearing about 11,000, but it's most likely 4 or 5 times that number
Wow.
based on emerging research.
Okay.
And
Now,
go ahead. We're going to alternate questions.
I know. We have to keep ourselves in check. When you say you're the Greater New Bedford, like suppose someone's in Fall River, that's like, can they go to New Bedford and
Absolutely.
search you out?
Yeah,
Like
absolutely.
what kind of area do you cover?
So all the human trafficking task force all around the nation, we all utilize the same hotline number,
Okay.
the National Human Trafficking Hotline number, which I could provide for you. It's 1-888-373-7888. So Fall River doesn't have a human trafficking task force, but anybody's welcome to give a tip.
Okay.
And what it goes with this is we had, I worked at DCF, so a lot of people remember me from there. So sometimes I get a phone call that somebody suspects human trafficking or sex trafficking, and they're not sure. I always tell them to call this number and do a tip because I've had a lot of situations in the last year where somebody thought there was sex trafficking or human trafficking going on. I talked to the sergeant that I work with, who's on the task force, and then a few times we found out there wasn't sex trafficking, but there was other stuff going on. So just like when you think of calling DCF because there's suspicion of neglect or
Right.
abuse, even suspicion's enough to call this number.
So this is a number that if someone had a suspicion, they could call, or if someone was a victim and they had the opportunity
Definitely,
to call, they could
that's
call
important.
too.
That's important to note that number's for victims as well.
So it's 1-888-373-7888.
8. Yep.
Okay, I was
And
trying to
that's the
read. It's a
national-
little far away from me, but that's good. All right, great. We can post that number later on. I'm curious about how someone becomes a victim of human trafficking. Can you give us a sense of how that occurs?
Absolutely, yeah. So there's a few risk factors, but the biggest risk factor is homeless youth,
Okay.
LGBTQ youth who've been kicked out of their home. And then it goes to substance abuse, socioeconomic issues. But Kayla was actually telling me not even an hour ago that when a child runs away within, what was it?
It was 48 hours. They'll probably fall victim, or not victim to, but victim to prostitution within 48 hours of leaving the home.
Really?
Yep.
That's an
What's
amazingly
the common
scary
age when
statistic.
you're talking about this?
I would say the common age for runaways, it starts as young as 13.
Yep. Sometimes younger. Yep.
Oh my gosh.
So I would say runaways, and then I would say the greater majority, probably 1/3, are comprised of children who've been in the foster care system.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that 48
That haven't
hours,
run away, that are
Just in the
still
system.
in the
Just
It's
system.
prevalent to
So-
all these people.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to get a picture of this. So there are basically predators out there that are really looking for these types of victims. They're really honing in on youths that have left their home, they run away, people who are socioeconomically in difficult situations. They really prey on them. It sounds like.
They prey on them because they can make roughly $150,000 a year per kid.
Wow, unbelievable.
So how do I know?
The average pimp has about 4 to 6 prostitutes. I don't really like using that word prostitute because if you're under 18,
It's not prostitution.
it's not prostitution. It's commercial sexual exploitation of a child.
Right.
But back in the day, like in the 90s and stuff, it would have been considered
Well,
prostitution.
it's a term most people can relate to, so
Right.
it's probably reasonable to use.
So how, am I noticing something, and what are the signs I'm looking for?
The things that I saw, and I don't find this to be like the most helpful information, but like malnourishment, mistreatment, obviously but they're not going to be taking them in public visibly to people. So I found that those tips weren't very helpful because it can be going on in a store that you're in and you have no idea.
Right.
Right below you, under your nose. And that's very realistic. So
And we've probably all run into victims of human
100%.
trafficking and never really have been aware that we have.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And you've most likely, everyone in this room, have absolutely been around people who are being labor trafficked.
Oh, yeah.
At restaurants,
Probably even more so, right?
Retail, beauty parlors, stuff like that.
So what does that look like?
Well, the main one is domestic work. And then the second one is retail, restaurants, things like that. It can look like somebody coming here from another country to provide for their family. And maybe somebody who's labor trafficking this person offers them a job at their restaurant. So I'm going to give you a job at my restaurant. I'm going to pay you X amount of dollars a week. And I'm going to provide a room for you and a little cell phone. And then I'll take this much out of your check. And then it ends up being that this person can never get out of that debt and they end up being labor trafficked.
So-
and that's a better situation because the person's actually getting paid. But it ends up for a lot of these people that they're just completely stuck here. They get cut off from their family. These people who labor traffic them will take their passport and sort of hold it against them.
So they're coming from another country where they have limited resources. They're promised something in the United States. It probably happens in other countries too, I'm guessing.
Absolutely.
Also.
100%.
They come over to the United States. They're promised a job, a place to live. And then once they get there, they realize that that's not as it was described.
Correct.
They're not getting enough income to break out of that situation. Maybe their passport's being held.
Maybe they were told they were going to work 40 hours a week and they're working 80.
So they basically are brought into slavery.
Yes, 100%.
Modern slavery.
Yeah.
So Kayla, how do you make a dent with that? I mean, like if I go into a restaurant and I see a 12-year-old, I'm thinking it's the owner's son.
Me too. Yeah.
I'm not. There's no.
think
flag
I see that
going
all
up.
the time.
Yeah.
I go to restaurants.
Right.
And,
I'm like, oh, how nice, little mom and pop.
Yeah.
and you think that, but you don't
That's
know
what I
that,
still
that may
think.
not even be the case,
Right.
right?
So like, how are we making any kind of dent in the labor force?
I say it's a really hard grasp to understand, because, and again, they're not coming forward for help, a lot of them, because they're
Right.
scared. They don't know where to go with it. They're illegal. They can't tell anybody, hey, I, came here illegally and I was promised this much money and this much, a life. And now they're not giving me that money, but I'm still here illegally. They're scared. They don't know where to go. They have nowhere to turn to. They're going to be deported again or worse,
Are they going to be deported though?
It depends. So the situation I talked about earlier, it's a case that I can't talk too much about, but I can tell you that there was a situation in Massachusetts of some females who were being sex trafficked, and the force helped them get their U visas to stay here.
Nice. Okay. So now, can you talk a little bit about the task force and maybe highlight some things that happened maybe last year that you were like, yes, finally, like this happened or it had an impact or we saw this? Why are you smiling?
It's a case I can't talk about, but I will say that there was a case in New Bedford. I'll just be as very vague as I can. It was a very horrific case. It sounded like, this was actually in the last 2 years. It sounded like something out of a movie. And one day maybe it'll be public and I can come back and talk to you about it more. But it was members of our human trafficking task force who saved those victims and made sure that they weren't deported. Or if they wanted to go back home, we assisted them with that. But they came here because they were seeking opportunities. You know, they were following maybe the American dream, or maybe they wanted to send money back to their respective countries. So that's what inspires me on the Human Trafficking Task Force, because I would have never known that 3 miles from my home this was happening.
I mean, it's all really hidden, isn't it? I mean, it's hard to know that it's out there.
Yes.
It's amazing that this is occurring.
And this
in our
was at a place
society.
that we all drive
Like I
by
said,
all
exactly.
the time.
You could be in a building and not even know it, and it's just going right on underneath your nose. You know.
She's absolutely right.
Yeah.
So now what kind of training do you do for professionals? Like I know like in the hospital, like for instance, as an example, if someone comes into the ER, there may be certain screening questions. But what can you talk about that type
Yes.
of training with professionals,
Yep.
but also the behaviors of the predators and, you know, what does that look like?
Yep.
You know,
Yeah, absolutely. So there are certain indicators that you want to look for if you have any idea that your child or somebody that you know that's a youth may be being commercially sexually exploited. Maybe all of a sudden they are more sexualized. Maybe all of a sudden they're dressing more provocative. Maybe all of a sudden they have bruises. Maybe all of a sudden they've lost weight. Maybe all of a sudden they have a Louis Vuitton bag or a cell phone. And Kayla was right earlier when she said those tips aren't the greatest, because some of those things I said can happen,
right.
you know, for arbitrary amount of
Right.
reasons. But it's sort of like you're sort of looking for
a pattern.
a pattern, exactly, a pattern. Like, you know, somebody who maybe wasn't dressing like this, dresses like that. And I think it gets really complicated because when you're a teenager and you're going through puberty, and especially with Generation Z, it's all about expressing yourself and taking empowerment. So
Sure.
we don't want to lead people down the wrong path. But if you have a suspicion, those are some things that you might look for in a child, like a stark change. Those are the more insidious ones. But if they're homeless or on the street, or they ran away because they're being abused at home, or they're LGBTQ, like Kayla said, within 48 hours, they are being approached for sure and offered a place to stay,
They're
a
an
hot
easy
meal.
target.
Yeah.
So it starts off there. They're approaching them as a benefactor. You know, I'm going to help you out, but obviously there's an ulterior motive. And unfortunately, some of these kids really don't have a lot of resources, or they don't understand what's really going on until they're too far into it. It sounds like.
Yeah, it does, because there was a situation where My Life, My Choice, an agency in Boston that was started about 20 years ago, because a 15-year-old girl who was living in a DCF group home under their nose was being sex trafficked.
Yeah.
And her abuser beheaded her and threw her in a dump. And you can look all this up on My Life, My Choice. And they started this organization, and I've learned a lot with them. I've done trainings with them, and they've really taught me a lot about how boys are victims too.
Yeah.
It's much, much less prevalent with boys, but like LGBTQ and things like that. So you picture, I don't know, you're 12, you're 13, your parents won't accept you for whatever reason. You run away. Now it's cold. You're at a bus station, and somebody approaches you like, do you need a ride? Because a lot of these pimps, they're very charming.
Right.
They're not what we think of when we think of like that 1970s movie, you know, somebody's like, you want to come in the car, hey, let's go get McDonald's. It starts off very insidious because it's grooming.
Yeah.
And it's hard to say no to that if you're out in the cold. And
So they're probably these people who are looking for to exploit children or whatnot. They're probably hanging out at bus stations
Absolutely.
and
Malls.
Malls.
Yep.
Okay. Places
Yep.
like that.
I've seen lots of posts, and I was going to say too, it goes down to it's a lot of women telling women right now.
That's
It's a lot of public sharing, and Facebook has been able to get a lot of the words out there. I've seen so many posts, so many posts
There's a ton out there.
of
I mean, on social
local
media.
Dartmouth, Wareham,
Yeah.
specifically Dartmouth, like the Target, the TJ Maxx. I've seen so many scary posts.
Now we have to get this out here because
Men coming out, multiple women going to store managers to tell them, hey, there's this creepy man following me. It's the same man that they're all complaining about. Then they suddenly notice there's multiple men, and they get escorted out to their car. All these different females that have now been reporting the same issue, the same suspicions. And this specific woman who made this post gets back to her car. She sees a brand new 15-passenger van, something crazy like that, and men come out of the store all with earpieces in and get in the car and leave.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
That's scary.
Very,
It really
very
is
scary.
frightening.
Especially as a woman, and if you want to go shopping by yourself and with your kids.
Yeah, I've seen a lot on social media about, how you're being targeted. And I don't know how realistic or true this is. You can probably tell us, people putting little like zip ties on car doors and things like that.
Air tags now too.
Air tags. There's been a few different things that were trending online. And I think that some of the situations that were shared might not have been human trafficking, but I'm still here for it being a conversation. I'm still here for people having situational awareness.
Right.
Absolutely.
Before I joined the Human Trafficking Task Force, I had a friend who, and this was what really inspired me to do this, she called me from Target because she felt like somebody was following her. And I'll never forget, I like brushed it off.
Sure.
And we talked later, she was absolutely terrified. And not even 2 or 3 days later, it was going around on Facebook that this had happened to some other females at this Target down near the Cape. And their managers started walking them out at night. So again, I don't know what that situation was because it never manifested on the news or anything like that, but she felt unsafe and it was happening to people. So after that, I don't know, it just kind of made me think, wow, I should have done better because I'm like, you're a target, you're fine. Like, the sun's still out, but she felt unsafe because somebody was following her around.
Yeah.
And I guess that's a really important point too, right? Like everyone says, check in with your gut instinct. Like, if you feel like something's up, like trust your instincts, and if you feel unsafe, just get out of it. I read something, I don't know if I was reading like one of those serial killer books or whatever, and he made a point of...
It was your autobiography.
It was my You would have been a victim. So anyways, he made a point of saying what made it easier for him was that people don't want to be rude and kind of say, what are you doing or anything. Like they literally don't want to be rude. And he played on that like all the time.
That's a funny point because, I have friends sometimes that they're just so rude to men when they come and I'm kind of like, well, that wasn't really necessary. But then I think about it and I'm like, well, I don't have to be nice to everybody either. And for that reason, because they will take your niceness as a weakness, 100%.
Right.
Now, is there a certain profile these predators are looking for? Like, I know you talked about the vulnerable populations, but what's like, if I'm a predator, I'm like oh yeah, easy mark.
Or
both.
I would say alone with children, constantly on your phone, not paying attention to your surroundings. Maybe
like everyone I saw.
Well,
yeah,
but when you're out in public, if I'm shopping, I try to now make it a point where I'm aware, I'm turning, I'm looking, I'm seeing who's behind me if I've seen this person multiple times. I even sometimes think maybe this person's starting to think I'm following them because they will use women as well to approach victims.
Yeah, I've heard that.
They will use women, and women are obviously more welcoming because you feel comfortable with another woman versus another strange man approaching you.
And the women that they're using are probably, I'm thinking, tell me if I'm wrong, these are women who have been brought into human trafficking, and now they're being used to find more victims.
And unfortunately, it's a promotion to them.
Okay.
Because they don't have the freedom. They're, again, they might be having their lives threatened, their family's life threatened. They may be now dependent on this pimp who's controlling them.
Having their kids held from them.
Having their kids held from them. And it's a promotion to them to be a recruiter. And based on emergent research, it usually is a female. Yeah. But Nancy, just to get back to your question, it's a lot of what Kayla said, but as far as what they're looking for, their number one target is definitely going to be somebody who's cut off from their family.
Yeah. For
sure. The more they're cut off from their family, the better. Somebody who's a loner, somebody who's vulnerable, somebody who doesn't have much of a voice. You might find somebody who ran away and they may prey on them and it might not work. Maybe this person knows better. Maybe they've been a little bit educated on the situation. Maybe they have a better support system. But if they're somebody who has low self-esteem, depression, those are all indicators that I've researched. That's like their number one target because you have to have somebody that you can control.
Do these people establish a relationship with someone before they go in for the, to market you?
So you're talking about the grooming phase?
Yeah.
So
is that common? Is that the most common thing? Is there a grooming phase?
So it depends on what population is being targeted. So if we're talking about homeless kids at a bus station, kids at a mall, things like that, these people, the predators, they know that they need probably something to eat, some clothes, things like that, something, shelter, things like that.
Right.
If it's somebody who's not in a situation like that, yes, there's a lot of grooming, a lot of texting. They're using online now more than ever, especially post-pandemic. To groom, and unfortunately they become professionals at grooming children to trust them. And like
Do they ever
Kayla
just
said,
grab someone without the whole grooming process, throw them in a van, and then bring them back to some central place?
I'd have to say that probably does happen.
Yeah.
That probably does happen, but this more of what I've seen
More of the grooming process.
Yeah, and that's really sickening.
Yeah, it's horrible.
Yeah.
Can I want to jump ahead a little bit. This is really a horrible question, but if someone is brought into human trafficking and there's not an intervention from a group like yours, what is the usual end for them? What happens? What can we expect will be the outcome?
Addiction and death.
Yeah, that's what I figured. I just wanted to hear.
No, it's a great question to ask because people, we want to have a dialogue about it, but the outcomes are so poor for them because let's say we have somebody who, we put them in a home and we do all this for them. They're going to have trauma, depression. Obviously, they need to get screened to make sure that they're healthy still, because a lot of times the pimps, they do get them hooked on a drug because it's easy to control somebody.
So that's part of the process, right?
If you're controlling
They're doing that so they can control them, basically.
Yep.
When you talked about kids in foster homes, what's the double check on the overwhelmed system? Is that?
It is. This whole situation of My Life, My Choice. Yeah, it was 20 years ago, but that was sickening. And I'm not blaming anybody, but this girl was in DCF care. She lived in their DCF group home, and she'd been being, sex trafficked for a very long time before she was murdered. So I'm really happy to have the organization. But I don't know how to answer that question because if they're in foster care, and I can tell you because I did work in foster care, I licensed homes for DEC all throughout Massachusetts. The last few years we were having was called the foster care crisis, meaning we couldn't get and probably still can't get enough foster homes. So that whole industry is already really top heavy.
Right.
So I don't know how that would work.
So
More education, more awareness, maybe.
Raising awareness.
Yeah.
Primacare is Southeastern New England's trusted leader in medical care. With offices in Fall River and surrounding communities, we're dedicated to your well-being. Our carefully selected team of more than 150 providers offers world-class primary and specialty medical care. Primacare doctors are supported by a skilled staff trained to deliver comprehensive radiology, imaging, and testing services. Primacare is large enough to take care of all your medical needs, but small enough to care for you personally. Primacare is by your side.
So as me as like little middle-aged housewife neighbor, like I may not, the red flags may not go up in my mind. Like we had talked about the restaurant scenario and everything else. But with other professionals who are in key positions, I'm thinking teachers, I'm thinking, our healthcare teams that can maybe spot something that have the screening tools necessary. Is there training available, and is that part of what the Women's Center does?
My biggest message, and I've been saying this post-pandemic, is anybody who's a mandated reporter, they have to take their role more serious post-pandemic than they did ever, because of people working virtually and hybrid, we're not getting eyes on people. I can tell you as a former employee of DCF that almost 80% of the referrals came from teachers, but they can't report what they can't see. So one, I would say if you're a mandated reporter, take that role more serious than you would before. But the Greater New Bedford Human Trafficking Task Force does provide trainings. I'm the training coordinator. Bunch of free trainings. The CAC, Child Advocacy Center in Fall River, they do an incredible training around commercial sexual exploitation of children. And all these trainings are free.
I mean, I know that in the medical field, there's education and training that takes place now, but I know that also 20 years ago, it wasn't really even on the radar for anyone.
That's true.
And it wasn't taught in medical school, but now there is a lot out there. But still, it's so hard to really recognize.
It is hard to recognize.
And what I worry about, thinking about this, when you started to talk a little bit about, some of the reasons that people end up in this situation, I worry about, economically, we're really headed as a country into a more difficult situation. I think there's going to be more people that could be exploited because of that. That's very concerning,
good point,
actually.
Chris.
I think that they're making a lot of money off of the industry, and it's going to continue to grow.
What was the number that we found? Wasn't it 150 billion?
Yes.
What?
150 billion?
150 billion.
That's how much
Human
money?
trafficking earns global profits of roughly 150 billion a year for traffickers, 99 billion of which comes from commercial sexual exploitation.
And you have to keep in mind that a commercial exploitation.
It's a tongue twister.
Goodness me, I thought I worked these all out before. You know, it's a market-driven criminal industry. So those who are paying for the commercial sex are who are driving the forces, you know?
Wow. Yeah, I think I've got to think it's got to be difficult for the police to crack down on some of this. I mean, you think about like, organized crime or whatnot, how difficult that was to really crack down on and still is. But then you have you have these big groups that are working together, networks. And this seems like it's more pockets, right?
I agree.
So it must be harder to really find these folks that are
It
involved.
really is.
Yeah,
So
that's just
I'm
my sense.
hoping. No, you're absolutely right, Chris. And I'm hoping that the trend goes toward more and more police departments creating a task force or a committee, something around that to raise awareness. Because again, if it wasn't for us joining the Human Trafficking Task Force, I wouldn't be sitting here right now. And since I've joined, I've done probably a dozen seminars, trainings, worked with My Life, My Choice, worked with victims, done trainings with victims, so survivors rather, so that they could speak about it. And all that awareness, I think, is helped. And like Kayla was saying about Facebook, I'm happy people are having conversations about it. But you mentioned earlier about a dent. I agree. I feel like it would be tough to put a dent in because it's so massive and it's been going on forever.
I don't think people understand how massive this problem
I
is.
don't think they do either.
I think that's why it's important that they're sharing. I'm sorry not to cut you off.
No, please.
But I think that's why it's important to see it on, because people don't think it's prevalent where you are. Oh, that'll never happen to me. Oh, that's not going to happen around here.
Well, it's not going to happen
Oh,
in
it's
my.
just
It won't
Target.
happen in my community.
Right,
It's gonna
exactly. And
happen,
it happens all the time.
in a different area.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, exactly.
Because
Not
we're
my neighborhood.
exactly. And going back to the human trafficking, I think it's great that they were able to make it local communities that are forcing their own task force, because that's huge. It's so important. You can't have the government coming in and going into these areas and not
100%.
knowing what's really going on. And it's important to have people who are in the city every day who see what's happening and that they actually want to make a change.
And it's coming from the federal level, which shows that they're taking it serious.
Right. And I think if I know there's resources local, I'm already feeling more comfortable.
Yeah.
I'm not like calling up the government, not knowing if I'm going to get in trouble.
Right, exactly.
And all this stuff. I'm
Yeah.
like
That's intimidating.
calling you,
Yeah.
so it's,
Right.
and
More
seeing
comforting.
you.
It's more,
Well,
it's easier.
yeah.
You want to call somebody that you know
Right.
you're familiar with. It's like something closer to you than.
And it sounds like a lot
so
of local
far-fetched.
police departments are aware now.
They are.
which is good.
Yep.
Thanks to efforts from groups like yourself.
So I was just thinking, when you're like the training, I just renewed for my nursing license, and they had mandatory training on there, and
Yeah.
it was domestic violence,
Yeah.
which is great.
The little 10-minute one?
Yeah.
Yeah, I had to do that too for my license.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But,
You could do it with your eyes closed.
Well, you're wicked smart, because I needed to read stuff, and
I don't believe that.
I couldn't do it with my eyes closed. I would have gotten a 90 instead of 100. So,
Oh my God.
anyways, but that would be a great platform for human trafficking, once the domestic
That's a good
violence
idea.
piece, because that's everyone who has to renew their license.
I couldn't
You know?
renew my license without taking
Right.
that.
I couldn't.
That's true.
Right. Right. So that would just be like a mandatory training that.
That's
boom.
a great idea.
It's interesting. I just had to redo my license for Board of Medicine, and there was a
Yeah.
whole section on dementia and Alzheimer's that you
Yeah.
have to do, but
Yeah.
there was no mandatory education on this,
Right.
which there should be.
Yeah. I think so.
It really should be.
Especially for pediatricians who
Right.
work with individuals under 18.
I mean, and then you capture everyone, and
Yeah.
Right.
it's a mandatory
Exactly.
piece.
Because I think right now the ER gets a lot of education.
I think they
on it.
do. I think they have an awareness.
They have an
I
awareness.
don't know how much.
Maybe not. I don't know how much education.
structured
but they have an
education,
awareness.
but they have a screening tool. They have the awareness.
But it needs to go throughout the whole medical field, certainly.
Yeah.
Kayla and I were lucky enough last week, to do a training at St. Luke's Hospital for about 24 SANE nurses.
Nice.
We're happy to do that. We only had 15 minutes to do a training, but we were so happy to be there because it was 8 to 4 training, and they'd like us to go back next year. But I couldn't agree more that providing these trainings, and I always emphasize that they're free. because, if you have to get CEUs or if it's not something that's mandatory for you to do, you might not be
Right.
so apt to do it. But if it's a free training and it can expand your knowledge, maybe you're more likely to do it.
All right. So tell our audience, if you don't mind, what are they looking for? What are they going to see that's going to clue them in that this is going on and they should
Yeah.
blow the whistle or call someone?
Yep. So I would say the biggest thing is for your own children who are in that teen age, even if they're not kicked out and homeless, to just look at anything that seems very suspicious and think that there might be more to it.
Okay.
We all know how much an iPhone costs. If all of a sudden a kid comes home with an iPhone, maybe they got it from a friend. Who knows? But things like that, those are some indicators. And if you have somebody in your neighborhood or even a relative, and your gut instinct is telling you something's off, somebody's going through puberty, or they're not acting like themselves. They have a mysterious bruise and say they fell, or maybe they're dressing more provocatively. Maybe they're being more sexualized.
Right.
Maybe they're more withdrawn. These are some of the indicators. And like Kayla said, they're not great.
No.
But those are some of the things to look for. And I would contact that number with just suspicion.
Okay. So that makes perfect sense. What I'm wondering though also is, I'm in a store, I'm in Target. It's not my family member. I just see something that I wonder about. What would I be looking for that would raise a suspicion so that I would call that number?
That's so tough.
That is
That's
tough.
such a tough question.
Well, do you want to take this
I can
one?
take a stab
Okay,
at
go
it.
ahead.
So I would compare it to so you're in a store and you see an infant obviously throwing a tantrum. Like, you wouldn't necessarily think anything of it. It's just an infant expressing their emotions. They're upset about something. But if it's a child that, this person isn't letting them, far out of their reach, they're not letting them communicate, look at, do anything like that, that would be one indicator. This child does not want to be with this person.
Okay.
Obviously, they're looking to control that child and they're just trying to get in and out with that kid. I would say that that's one way.
Yep.
With children, at least. I don't know. I can't really think of anything about for adults.
My best advice for that question, which I got more with child abuse than sex trafficking, is go tell the manager.
Yeah.
It might be a lot to record that person. I wouldn't do that. And it might be too much, right, Nancy, to go up to this person and put yourself at jeopardy.
Yep.
But if you see something and you feel concerned, why not just go to the manager, let them know what you see, and now it's on them to do something about it, so you don't leave there feeling like you did nothing.
So you're better off to err on the side of caution.
I really,
Right.
yeah.
I mean,
if you're comfortable,
what's the worst that's going to happen? You're going to, maybe feel embarrassed, but you might save a life.
you might save a life. Like the last person I gave this number to ended up following up with me, and there was a child at danger. They weren't being sex trafficked, but she ended up really helping a group of girls, actually. So that's what I would say. Don't put yourself in harm's way, but tell the manager. Yeah.
And God forbid you're recording them and they catch you and then they take off.
Or you confront them and they wait for you in the parking lot or something like that, because we want to encourage people, Kayla and I, to help, but we also want to encourage people to also be safe
Yes.
and have situational awareness.
This is another, it's a kind of a dark thought I'm thinking, but I'm just thinking about the natural history of all this. I mean, there seems like a lot of kids are brought into this, younger, adolescents and whatnot. And like you said, often this ends in, either death or addiction. But it's almost like there's a shelf life to these people. So like when they get to a certain age, do they outlive their usefulness to the human trafficker? And then what happens to them then?
100%. Based on just some of my research I've done, some of the people that we see now that are chronically homeless, they may have been victims of labor trafficking and sex trafficking. Because you're right, you're going to age out of that.
You're going to age out, and you're not as easy to control.
Absolutely.
When you're older.
Exactly.
So
exactly. Once you develop that prefrontal cortex,
right,
you might not be of use anymore to them, because they need you to literally. I'm glad you used the word slavery, because oppression is real and it does exist.
Yeah, I don't know if that was a good word to use or not.
I think it was a good word,
but it's obviously different than the slavery we had in our country.
Right? Yeah, absolutely.
But it's modern day slavery in many ways.
It is.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So how are the police different in handling this now over 10 years ago?
So for me, the biggest thing that I've seen is recognizing that if they're under 18, it's commercial sexual exploitation of a child.
Okay.
And there are services for them that are in place versus that 16-year-old girl is a prostitute. there's more awareness around it because, if you see a girl street walking and selling herself and you're going to, maybe look down on that person. But now there's more awareness around that. And people think now, maybe she was sexually abused at home and ran away. Maybe she was LGBT. There's just more awareness around it. So I think they've made it more safer for victims to now be survivors and get services. Right. That's the biggest thing. And I don't really remember hearing the word human trafficking 20 years ago.
No, I don't think it existed.
And sex trafficking and labor trafficking and things like that. So I think you guys having us on this show is incredible. I'm glad that the federal government is doing more about it. And I'm glad, like Kayla's saying, that there's a lot of awareness on Facebook, people just having more situational awareness. Like Kayla said, when you go into a store, just being observant instead of on your phone. Or if somebody's following you, don't be like, oh, that's nothing. Maybe you should check your space.
Guys, what's happening with the end users now? Like these people that are buying these kids for sex, are they are the penalties harsher?
If they're lucky enough to get caught, it's a minimum of 10 years.
The abusers
the predator.
The predators, not the people who are buying.
No, I'm saying some old skanky guy.
Those who are driving the force, who are paying for the commercial
those
sex.
who are,
If you can get them, if they are able to get caught, there's going to be huge penalties for them. But they have a way of, not really having ways to track them. You know what I mean?
Right.
A lot of
So those are
they never give their real name.
Those are the ones involved with the human trafficking that are exploiting the children directly, getting the children to.
Because there's a whole hierarchy.
But I think what Nancy's talking about is more the quote, the Johns.
Yes.
The guys who are paying for the services. What happens to them? I mean, do they get a slap on the wrist, or do they actually go to jail? And how severe
what happened To Catch a Predator?
We kind of need that, right?
I would say that
because I mean, they're if they weren't doing this, then there'd be no business.
Right.
I mean,
100%.
Right. So you have to attack it from many angles.
Excellent point. So is that part of the awareness too? It's like, hey, you're going to dial into this. You're going to get caught and boom.
There is, but the trend that I've noticed is they're trying to go to the root cause of it. So there are still penalties for Johns. You're absolutely right. But just from what I've seen, just in the 3 years I've been, involved with human trafficking, they're really trying to get to the root cause of it.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Which I know what you mean. You're like the Johns, because you're saying if there were no Johns, there wouldn't be people to support this $150 billion industry.
Infrastructure.
And I'm guessing because I didn't research this, but I'm assuming they tried that. And it was just like an insurmountable obstacle. So maybe they're trying to.
I would have to say that it's something that's not in the dark, the dark web, and people are using. They're what's the word I'm looking for? I'm not tech savvy, so they're using
synonyms, aliases,
and other ways to what's it called when you ping your location off and it's showing you from some of these
like
people.
Shady. That's what it's called.
So
shady. We're gonna call it shady.
Different ways to divert it from yourself. It's impossible to track somebody if their IP address is being all over the place and stuff like that. A VPN, yes.
A VPN, thank you
so much. Yes.
I would have never guessed that.
I would never have guessed that either, but that's exactly
That's
exactly
That's VPN,
yes. Yep. So, I mean, I would assume that if they're not all of them are tech savvy like that either. I'm not here to say that all of these Johns are super smart like that, but they have to be smart enough in some type of way to not get caught. But they're not always that smart to not get caught either.
Yeah. And a lot of the victims, if they do get rescued or they're able to get in a situation, tells everything you know. His name's Big Mike and he drives a black car. They
don't know much.
Right.
They really don't. And that's one of the biggest things. None of them know their actual name. And that's obviously it's intentional, but they go through really great depths to sort of throw people off. My name's Big Mike. I moved from Wisconsin when they're from Rhode Island. They just create a whole narrative so that they are not easily found. Which makes it really scary, right?
Yeah. Most of the victims or survivors that you've dealt with are they protective of the people that got them into this? Like, what's their mindset and their psyche like?
They're protective while they're under their pimp's care, yes.
Okay.
Because the grooming in the beginning, it turns more abusive because we know that, intimate partner violence, domestic violence is about power and control. Yeah. So, they are. I have seen that 100%.
Is it like a Stockholm syndrome?
Yeah.
A little bit of a Stockholm
That-
syndrome.
yeah,
And then it only flips when this person knows they're going to be safe.
Okay.
Because some people don't have faith in the criminal justice system. And
Right.
even though they are being sex trafficked,
Right.
there might be a sense of security with there because maybe they don't have the support system and the upbringing that somebody has to really acknowledge that. So once they know that they're safe, that's what I've seen when they're finally willing to give the information that needs to be given.
Do the people that are recruited into this lifestyle and then start recruiting other people, like that seems like a common chain of
Yeah.
events that happens. If they just have had it one day or they see something horrific and they're like, that's it, I'm calling it. Do they get in trouble or are they supported? Like, because
by law enforcement.
They go to
Yeah.
the police.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Because think about a person like that who can come now and provide information that can
Oh, that's
potentially.
true.
So the case earlier that
right.
I didn't give too many details on, I know that members of the Greater New Bedford Human Trafficking Task Force were able to get to the top.
Wow,
To the top.
that's great.
That is great.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
And that probably doesn't happen often.
No. That was huge.
So, your regional task force, do you still like communicate like nationally at a national level too?
Oh yeah. Yes.
And
yeah.
So you always like at the edge of like the best practices
Oh,
and
yes.
what really works.
Yes,
And
we got trained by Homeland Security. It was
Wow.
you have to go through all that, and there are members on the task force from Homeland Security, a bunch of agencies that I can't think right now, but you name it, DCF, Homeland Security. It's very multidisciplinary, but they report on a federal level too.
So, Son, you've talked about the training and that you're a trainer.
Mm-hmm.
So, give us some examples of some information how you train groups of people.
So
Like, what is it that they kind of don't know that you're opening their eyes to?
So mainly what we try to do, it all depends on the age, but let's say we're going to UMass tomorrow night in real life. We have a training tomorrow. So we're going to do a workshop for a sorority and any students who want to go on healthy
Oh.
relationships.
Nice.
So we're going to gear that toward their age group.
Right.
We're going to gear that toward statistics for their age group. We're going to gear that toward, specifically, being a victim of intimate partner
you
violence.
customize it.
We do, yeah.
That's great.
All of them, every single training. Kayla and I do go the extra mile to find out who the audience is so we can adapt it to, because, for instance, the training we do with 7th graders is very different from the trainings we do with 8th graders.
Okay.
So that's a really interesting comment. The training you do with 7th graders. Can we back up and talk about
course.
that?
Yeah.
What's this training you do with 7th
So-
graders and who's inviting you in?
The schools are, and we give them a lot of say. So they don't want, certain schools aren't comfortable with us talking about domestic violence.
Sure.
And that's their prerogative. So for 7th graders, the trend is they like us to do sexual harassment for 7th graders
Yep.
and healthy relationships for 8th graders.
Okay.
But
Nice.
Dr. Nan Stein, whose work I'm a huge fan of, she's really big on teaching kids in elementary school about boundaries and about things like that. Obviously, you have to adapt the language, but her literature really focuses on, working with children before they go through puberty. So we're excited that we got invited to a charter school to do a training on bullying.
Oh, that's great.
So in that bullying, we talk about bullying versus teasing versus joking,
Yeah.
things like that.
One of our upcoming episodes is going to be
bullying,
on
yeah.
bullying with one of the school counselors. And we're also, when we had talked with her, she said not only bullying, what we've been teaching more of now is coping strategies with
Coping
all the
strategies.
social media that's out there. Because she goes,
Social media is huge. I was circling way back to earlier already. This is minutes ago. What to do about specifically with your kids? How can you monitor them? Technology these days. You have
Right.
if you're not monitoring your kids' phones, I don't care at what and I don't have any kids, so this is coming from me. Take it with a grain of salt, but it needs to be monitored. Especially if you have an 8-year-old with a cell phone, what are they doing on the phone? You don't know if they have so much access to so many different things.
It's really bad. I mean, they can so easily get onto a site that they should not be on.
Exactly, and
There's so much out there that's just so detrimental to children.
100. It's crazy, and if you're not monitoring it,
It's so hard as a parent though, because you want to, you want to give them their independence to an extent, right?
Again, I said this is coming from me with no kids, so take it with a grain of salt.
Time, you realize as an adult how much badness there is out there.
Badness.
I would say it's coming from somebody who grew up in the generation who started to use technology more. You know what I mean?
Me, Generation
Very, very little limited, parental supervision. I was left alone with a computer all the time.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
So she brings up a really important point, and that's when we talk about, you talked a little bit earlier about like the history of sex trafficking. It's been around for millennia, but based on research, it really spiked in the 70s.
Okay.
And a documentary I watched was tying that back to the porn industry exploding.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. It was a documentary on Frontline, by Frontline on YouTube. But Kayla is really big about, when we do our trainings, about the internet. And it is true that, especially post-pandemic, they've been using predators, abusers, pimps. They've been using the internet massively.
Well, that's what I was just going to ask you. It's like part of this, a big segment of this has to be internet.
It is. Even if they've never met a child, if they're getting that child to send them sexually explicit photos, that alone is
especially even with the gaming. Like,
and imagine how easy
live.
it is to catfish a child.
Oh my God, of course. You're their best friend.
Yep.
It's so complicated now. I mean, just, when I was a kid, it was like, you get on your bike and you go out and you ride out and your parents would say,
1848.
Yeah, it wasn't not as long as when you were a kid, but Nancy is older than me. I want everyone to know that.
I am. It's true.
By 6 months, so it's really not that bad. But you remember, right? You'd get on your bike. Maybe it wasn't like this for you, but for us.
Home when the lights come on.
Exactly. And my brothers and I would go ride around. We'd go down Oak Grove Cemetery and all, and look for Lizzie Borden's grave and all that stuff that kids do. But literally the rule was come back when the streetlights come on. And when the streetlights came on, you would be like a mile and a half from home and you'd pedal like a madman to get home. It's sad that kids really can't do that stuff anymore.
Can't. There are no streetlights now because they're online. And, it's like Kayla said, it's really easy to catfish a child. And, you think, if they're on Facebook, what do they look like? But like you mentioned earlier, they are making sure that the recruiters look a certain way. They're very charming. They're very likable.
Right.
To me, there's always been
more
this
isolation to your point now. It's like, we had all the neighbors looking for you. Like they'd be,
exactly.
It's true.
Mrs. Griffin be calling my mom, Michael did this.
To me as a parent,
none of that trained.
It's kind of like, how do you find that balance between, like, you want your child to have a childhood, but you want them to be safe.
I know.
And you need to talk to them about this stuff. But then when you do, you're affecting their innocence and their childhood.
Right.
Very complicated.
It is complicated.
When do you start talking about this with kids?
And it's
right
tough
before
too,
puberty.
Before puberty.
It's like, get off the game, Johnny, and go out and play. Well, maybe you don't live in a safe neighborhood.
Exactly.
So then what?
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you can start early on with boundaries as well. Like, the vocabulary, you have to pick and choose how you talk to them. But you can start teaching them red flags and boundaries from a certain age. If this doesn't seem right to you, that means maybe, how to trust your instincts. And if you teach a child, maybe they don't like being hugged by Uncle Timmy. Like, okay, so you don't have to hug Uncle Timmy. That's a boundary. You know what I mean? Things like that.
Where a lot of us were raised. Like, I remember you had to, when it was Christmas or Thanksgiving, if your aunties came over, you had to hug them.
Yeah,
you had to, she's right.
It's just so much more complicated now than it was.
It is.
We should do an episode on child safety over the internet.
That'd be a nice one to do, yeah.
Because there's just so much that you have to guard for now. And I think a lot of parents are just so out of their element with.
And I can see how it's difficult to want to monitor your child's phone like that and still have a line of trust because, you also want to teach them that they have their right to their privacy.
And you would have to imagine there's so many ways to these people are tech savvy. There's so many ways to bypass child locks and everything else,
Yeah.
They've made a living out of learning how to bypass that.
Yeah.
One other thing I want to bring up, which you can correct me if I'm wrong, but my suspicion is that this crosses all socioeconomic boundaries, although there may be more sexual exploitation that happens in certain communities, and you've mentioned some of that. I don't think anyone is really safe, right?
Agreed.
So if you're, there may be people out here listening to say, well, I come from an upper class type of background. I live in a really ritzy type of community. This still happens there, doesn't it?
Yep. And you can find some information online. If you go to mass.gov, there's some links there that show a map of Massachusetts with all the hot spots where they get the most calls at the National Human Trafficking Hotline.
Really?
And obviously there's a big red dot over Boston.
Yeah.
But it was all down New Bedford, South Coast, other areas too. So you're right. It's not like it was just Boston.
And does it happen in rural areas too?
does, yep.
And it's everywhere,
Oh, yeah.
right? It's not
Absolutely.
just focused in big cities.
Yep.
And it's interesting. So we all have to be aware.
Yeah. In a rural area, you might have kids who are even more isolated
Exactly.
than they are
There's
in a
nobody-
bigger city.
Sure.
Right. So, guys, when we're closing this conversation, what is it that you really want to get out to our listeners? What type of messaging do you want to leave our
I think
listeners with?
the biggest message for me is, October's Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Wear the color purple to show your solidarity. As far as human trafficking, labor trafficking, sex trafficking, if you have even the slightest suspicion, and I've spoken to the people, so they want you to call.
Okay.
You're not bothering anybody, even if you're like, I'm not sure I saw something. Obviously, if you can have an address, that would be great, but you're not bothering them by providing that information. So I would encourage people, if you see something, contact the number for sure.
And let's
We
get
have
that
that
number
number
again.
Yeah, it's 1-888-373-7888.
That's great. And even if you have a suspicion, just call and
suspicion,
talk it
yeah.
out.
If you see something, say something.
There you go. I
Yeah,
like
100%.
that.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Perfect.
Perfect.
Guys, thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Really
Thank you for having
wonderful work
us.
you're doing. It's just so great to get the message out there. It's so important. And I know there's a lot of people who benefited from this. And thank you.
Thank
we
you.
really greatly appreciate you
appreciate
being
it.
on the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So, well, this is the conclusion of this show. We could talk for hours.
I know. I can't believe it's been an hour already.
I know. It's
I
it's
will
hard
say
to believe.
before we just go ahead and close off,
Okay.
we're going to do almost like a part 2 to this episode. We're going to have a survivor story that will be airing after this airs. So that will be very interesting.
That'll be
too.
fascinating. I can't wait for
Yeah,
that.
yeah, and she's quite the survivor. So
That's great.
I'm looking forward to that.
yeah,
Yeah,
me
for sure.
So I want to thank you, Hassan and Kayla. Thank you. You were wonderful guests. You really provided a great amount of information for our viewers. And I want to thank, of course, Bay Coast Bank, which is just right for all your financial needs. Visit baycoast.bank or call 508-678-7641. Without Bay Coast, we wouldn't be able to do these types of podcasts.
Yes. Yep.
So thank you.
Thanks.
Thank
All right.
you.
Have a great day, everyone. And, check us out on your favorite podcast platform, YouTube. And we're on Facebook also. Take care.